Hello to all the listeners. Today we will be discussing a very important topic in the domain of international relations. This is liberalism in IR. Friends, liberalism has always occupied a special place in the domain of political science. Therefore, in international relations also, liberalism has found its space. At the outset, let's understand what does liberalism stand for. Liberalism's main focus is freedom, freedom of the individual. This freedom of the individual is opposed to any kind of autocracy, tyranny, monopoly of power. This is why when we look into modern democracy, liberalism is seen as one of the features of modern democracy. Liberalism is also called as the fulcrum of modern democracy that places freedom of the individual at the utmost importance. Now, whenever we talk about liberal democracy, let us understand what it stands for. Now, whenever you look around and in the newspaper, in everyday life, there is a debate on liberal democracy. What are the things that come to your mind or that comes across you? Free and fair elections, rule of law, protection of civil liberties, absence of any kind of monopoly, privilege to liberty of the individual, amongst others. So, liberal democracy is a paraphernalia of processes that signify safeguarding liberty of the individual. Elections ensure that after every periodic time of say 5 years, 4 years, people are responsible to make choices for their representatives. Representatives are representatives that have to abide by consent. And this is why whenever we look at liberalism, freedom is always the starting point. Now, from this domain of politics, let's understand how liberalism finds itself in international relations. Liberalism, when discussed within the realm of IR theory, has indeed evolved into a distinct entity. Now, international relations has often been a discipline of debates. The first debate in IR was the debate between the realist and the idealist. And from herein, we find traces of the liberal school of IR. For the realist, the global politics was a domain of power competition, whereas liberalism says that it need not be about power competition, but about the domain of cooperation also. This brings us to the definition of liberalism in international relations. We can say that it is about concepts, it is about debates as to how institutions, certain behaviors, economic connections, the kind of value they contain, the kind of significance they hold for international politics, the kind of important parameters they have to attain cooperation of relations among states, and above all, how they mitigate the violent power of the states. Because IR always surrounds around the notion of states, the realist always portray international relations as a domain of power politics, whereas the liberal perspective tries to bring focus into the idea as to how institutions, certain amount of behaviors, economic connections, how they mitigate the power of the states. Now, when we say that liberalism is about freedom of the individual and also about protection of civil liberties. Now, there are certain kinds of rights that liberalism has always seen as the main rights that the government has to protect. Let's recall John Locke here, who said that right of an individual, a person, to life, liberty and property, that is the highest goal of government. An unchecked power, be it be a monarchy or dictatorship, cannot protect the life and liberty of its citizens. Now, this focus on life and liberty becomes central to understand why liberalism is important in IR, because the main focus then of the liberal school of thought in international relations then revolved around the need to debate, to analyze, to deliberate on construction of institutions, of norms, of values also that protect individual freedom by limiting and checking the political power. Now, this focus on life and liberty of the individual has also implication for the use of war, warfare, bloodshed in relations among states. Because when liberalism gives primacy to life and liberty of its citizens by a state, then according to realists, whereas warfare, power, national interests are the main focus of international relations. Therefore, in IR then, liberalism states activities abroad can also have a strong influence on liberty at home. What about having no militaristic foreign policies? What about having foreign policies that give primacy to liberty of the citizens? And whenever we give primacy to liberty of its citizens, then what happens there is that primacy is placed on absence of warfare, certain amount of mitigation of negative influences of state policy. Whenever we say that life and liberty are the highest goals of any government, so this government would also then imply safeguarding, respecting life and liberty of citizens of other states. Whenever we talk about unchecked power, we talk about saying that unchecked power cannot be present. Similarly, then in international relations, such states are bound to respect sovereignty and integrity of other states, because these states at home would be accountable and responsible to their citizens for their actions. So therefore, the liberal school in international relations tries to construct ideas and based on assumptions that protect individual freedom by limiting and checking political power. So what then is the main debate, the first main debate of international relations? That is, how to develop a political system that liberalism stands for, that can allow states to protect themselves from foreign threats without subverting individual liberty of its citizens. Now, it is all said that democracy is the best check on tyranny, because democracy gives space to the states to protect its individual. Democracy gives space for preservation of individual liberty, because democracy is a government in the famous definition, that is, by the people, for the people, of the people. Now, what are the ways by which we can have institutional check on the power in liberal states? Now, let's understand what we just debated, how democracy keeps a check on the power. Number one, namely free and fair elections. Now, elections give a periodic occasion to the people to voice out their concerns, to choose their representatives, and this election then indirectly acts as a checking device on any kind of unrestrained power. The space for unrestrained, autocratic, monopolistic power definitely then reduces, followed by the fact that there is division of political power amongst different branches and levels of the government. For example, in a parliamentary system, the executive is separate from the legislature. Then there is a judiciary that has the power of judicial review, which at times has moved to the realm of judicial activism. And these checks and balances in the use of political power definitely constrain monopolistic use of power. And using these main ideas as to how an institutional check on power through free and fair elections, through division of political power amongst different branches and levels of the government, there is possible to build a political system that can allow states to protect themselves from foreign threats without subverting liberty of the citizens. Now, this brings us to one of the main contributions that liberalism makes to international relations theory. Dear listeners, this is called as democratic peace theory. We just deliberated how democracies constrain power, how democracy acts as a check on unrestrained use of power. Democratic states, it is said, are highly unlikely to go to war with one another. Now, when we say this favorite dictum, that is, democracies do not attack each other, and to read more on it, we must infer the work of Immanuel Kant, and the name of this work of the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the name of the work is Perpetual Peace. Now, let's understand in everyday language that why democratic states are highly unlikely to go to war with one another. Firstly, that we just have been discussing, that there have been internal restraints on power. Power is checked in a democratic apparatus through periodic free and fair elections, through internal division of power at the level of various governments and departments. Also, if you look at the larger framework, democracies tend to see each other as legitimate. They tend to respect each other's space for sovereignty and integrity because they internally value individual freedoms. Therefore, they try to preserve democracies in other states. And this is why democracies are often seen as unthreatening to each other. And this very space of respecting each other's sovereignty, of respecting each other's territorial integrity, gives democracy the capacity for cooperation with each other. However, to add here, there have been debates where these ideas have been debated. At times, two countries may be democracy, but they have gone to war. And at that time, we need to be cautious in understanding and debating democratic peace theory, that we need to see that whether the democracy in a particular country, is it only procedural or is it on a larger thick framework of substantive democracy. But nonetheless, it is unanimously asserted that democratic peace theory is one of the most important inputs that liberalism provides to IR theory. Democracy, which gives space for internal restraints on power, which gives space to division of political power, democratic apparatus tend to see each other as legitimate and unthreatening, and this is why it is presumed by the liberal school in international relations that democracies are highly unlikely to go to war with one another. Moving ahead, so what we see there at the very outset, when we invoke the inter-paradigm debate, the first debate in the discipline of international relations was the idealist versus realist. The idealist school in course of time came to be known as the liberal school of thought, and the first guiding parameter of the idealist school was the rejection of idea of power politics that liberal school always gives value to. The idealist school outrightly says no to international politics as an image of competition, as an image of power politics. They criticize the notion of security, the principles of warfare of realism. They try to shift the focus on perceiving international relations as a domain of outright competition towards the paradigm of mutual benefits. They say that the domain of IR is much plural. Of course, states are important, but alongside states, we may have international organization, non-governmental organizations that may influence policies, that may factor in cooperation on certain common linkages for mutual benefits. Therefore, the liberal school of IR sees international relations as more cooperative, as having more ambits for cooperation and less conflictual than what the realist school in international relations perceives. So therefore, when we look at international relations, we cannot ignore international institutions. Let's take an example of an international institution that comes to your mind that has been used as a forum for solving international disputes. Yes, United Nations is one of them. The United Nations, formed in 1948, has been used as a forum to solve international disputes by arbitration and by avoiding war. Let's talk about the peacekeeping forces the UN has deployed at various countries that has factored in peace and cooperations. Now, alongside international institutions, the liberal school also highlights the benefits of trade. Trade is seen as an engine of growth. Trade is seen as an interface of interdependence, and this trade and economies are interconnected. Economies are connected through trade, and when things are connected with each other, the cost of war and cutting of linkages are very high. They are then very less likely to go to war with each other. And then comes the other domain, that is, well established democracies do not go to war with one another. So therefore, the liberal school of IR has various strands: the commercial liberalism, the Republican liberalism and the sociological liberalism. And all these schools of thoughts have main notions, that is rejection of power politics. They criticize security, warfare principles of realism. They try to shift the focus of international relations on mutual benefits, therefore highlighting more cooperation, less conflict. They try to assert as to how international organizations and NGOs influence policies. They make us understand how international institutions can provide an ambit for factoring peace and cooperation. And also they try to see that how trade becomes a platform to interconnect economies. Now, when we look at that international system was structured as a liberal world order after the Second World War. We just discussed international organizations like the United Nations here. So, international institutions, organizations and norms. What are norms? That is expected behaviors of the world order then are built on the same foundations, that is of the domestic liberal institutions and norms. And this presence of multiple actors, this presence of various stakeholders in the domain of international politics ensures that power is diluted, power is dispersed internationally then as what you see as compared to what the liberal says. So therefore, the liberal school is often debated or seen as the plural school of thought. The liberal ideas are akin to what pluralism stands for, wherein power is enjoyed by multiple stakeholders. There is no unipolarity, there is no concentration. And when power is dispersed, of course, one has to recognize the presence of various kinds of international actors that have an influence. So, the international system that was structured by liberal world order built after the Second World War, the ambit of Second World War, 1939 to 1945. After that, international institutions, organizations and norms, they are built on the foundations of democratic ethos, and therein the power is diluted and dispersed. Another thing where we see that there is no international police force to enforce international law, then why and how can we say that democracies will not attack each other? Because an aggressor knows that when they are breaking international law, then they are going to face lot of risk that have considerable international backlash. When we say that democracies don't go to war, when we say that there is prevalence of international laws, and when we say there are norms, regimes, institutions to factor in cooperation. So, when we say that if an attack happens, an aggressive state also then risks out missing on the benefits of peace, that is gains from international trade, foreign aid, diplomatic recognition. All these act as a check on unrestrained use of power in international politics. All this acts as a check on the use of autocratic mechanisms in the conduct of international relations. So, what we see that the main opponent of the realist school of thought are the liberals. Now, there are certain similarities and dissimilarities between the realist and the liberal school of thought. At the very outset, let us understand that both the schools, the the realists and the liberals, they see state as the main rational unit of analysis in international politics. For them, states are the main actor. Both the realists and the liberals have been seen as status quo theories. They are rational theories that tend to preserve the status quo. And again, when we look at them from an Asian perspective, certainly both the schools, the realist and the liberal school, have a Western bias. They tend to cater to a notion of democracy, to the idea of individual liberty that has existed in the West. So again, both see states as the main actor. They both are status quo theories, and certainly they have a Western bias. These are certain strands of similar thoughts that we see in the liberal school of IR. Now, when you look at liberal realist IR debate, what you see here is liberalism opposes realism as the main thesis of IR. It tries to give emphasis to human society, human nature in a different format. Let's recall, what does the realist school stands for? The realism, when we recall the 6 principles of political realism by Hans Morgenthau in his book Politics Amongst Nations, the struggle for peace and power. Morgenthau's first principle outlines the human nature. Human nature is seen from the work which we have also seen in Thomas Hobbes, in Machiavelli, that is, human nature is nasty, brute and short. And this nature lays the foundation of state. That is, state is there to ensure its survival in a system marked by self-help. On the contrary, the liberal IR school of thought says that nature of human society can supposedly in a good way also change. Society can evolve. There are good and bad tendencies both in human nature and society thereof. The liberal school of IR gives primacy to the cooperative, the good, the boonful side of the human nature that is evolving the society every time. And in turn, when human nature can evolve, when society can evolve, then cooperation, interaction, integration between different states on the basis of moral ideals and common values is possible under some circumstances. And again, the important assumptions comes that democracies don't attack one another. So therefore, as opposed to the realist school of IR, the liberal school highlights cooperation, highlights how interaction builds cooperation, highlights how economic linkages and integration between different states can be sustained based on moral ideals and common values under some circumstances. Therefore, the image of international relations that was seen by the realist school as conflictual is seen by the liberal school as much of positive, as much of cooperative. A special institution that may control sovereign national states. The liberals places faith on existence of institutions that may usher world peace, that may lead to cooperation among states. And we have often talked about special institutions like United Nations and its specialized agencies. They have been acting to ways, in manners, in means to safeguard world peace, to factor in cooperation among states. Then anarchy, that has been debated by the neo-realist school of international relations. The neoliberal school in international relations, and whenever you try to study neoliberalism in international relations, we must refer to the work of Keohane and Nye. Keohane and Nye, in their significant work, that is Power and Interdependence, 1979, give the very significant idea of complex interdependence. Complex interdependence implies that there are various multiple linkages among states. When there are various multiple linkages among states, then there is absence of hierarchy of issues. The realists often bifurcated the power as hard power versus soft power. What was hard power? Your army, your navy, your military, your arms, your warfare. What is soft power? The new domains of power: knowledge, economy, culture, human resources. The neoliberal school of thought says that this distinction between hard power and soft power is getting blurred, is somehow getting understated because there are new actors on the world stage. Of course, the state is important. They do not dismiss the significance of state. For them, definitely, the state is rational unit of analysis. But at the same time, there is existence of international organizations, supranational institutions that are equally important in policy making. There is presence of non-governmental organizations, other forms of stakeholders that have an impact on the decision making. Therefore, this anarchy, the idea of anarchy that the neo-realists in the work of Kenneth Waltz talk about, this anarchy can be eliminated. There are potentials of harmonizing it. There are avenues to pacify it. And there are mechanisms to even modernize this thought. So, anarchy for the liberals and the neoliberals can be eliminated, harmonized, pacified and modernized. And then the state behavior is just not only about national interests, what the realist school says or what the neo-realist stand for. State behavior is also about common values, factoring benefits, looking out avenues of mutual cooperation. When we see that the state government is not the single institution responsible in IR. So therefore, the realist and the neo-realist try to give a very centralized picture of international relations wherein the state is the only actor in IR. Of course, both realists and the liberals are rational theories, but the liberal school steps one step forward and says that of course state is important, but there are other actors also which are significant and responsible in IR. The state and human nature changes permanently. It is evolving, it is improving, and this has the potential of giving space for freedom, liberty, strengthening the democratization process, avoiding war, paving out avenues of cooperation. Therefore, as opposed to the realist school that sees the state and human nature in slightly a pessimistic, centralized, dominating zone, the liberals say that the state and human nature are evolving. they have the potential to change, they have the tenacity to improve, and they have the avenues to develop the growth of freedom, to pave way for strengthening the democratization process. So therefore, the political realism, as we saw in the 6 principles of realism by Morgenthau, views states as the primary actor, whereas for the plural school, the non-state actors are equally important in international system. Then this debate of segregation of domestic versus international. Anarchy, the notion in the work of neo-realist school of thought, anarchy often said that there is a bifurcation. Domestic, where hierarchy prevails, where there is law and order. You have mechanisms to catch people for disobeying law. International, there is anarchy. There is no centralized rule. There is no mechanism to ensure that law is in operation. So, the liberal school says that domestic politics should not be ignored too. The primary emphasis should be on actions and interests of individuals and groups. The domestic state, the society thereof, they constitute the central issues of politics also. So, this debate and distinction between domestic and international is somewhere not accepted by the liberal school of thought. And when we see that when political realism views state as the primary actor, the liberal school of IR views international relations as multipolar, where non-state actors are equally important in the conduct of international relations. When we try to dub the world in form of binaries, us versus them, domestic versus international, certain binaries are not accepted by liberal school because they say that domestic politics cannot be overlooked. One has to factor in how the actions and interests of individuals and groups within any state and society thereof, they too are important issues of politics. So therefore, the focus then comes on regional and international organizations. Let's talk about regional organizations. Certain examples that come to your mind? Yes, your ASEAN, your SAARC, your NAFTA. All these are regional organizations that have paved way for interdependence, integration, interchange, exchange, wherein trade and exchange of people and services acts as a mechanism to integrate economies. States can then indeed cooperate by themselves. And when states cooperate by themselves, then indeed anarchy is mitigated by regimes and such institutional cooperation. Let's talk about how regional organizations can make states cooperate by themselves, which in turn nullifies or somewhere contains the impact of anarchy. That is, today all regional organizations, they are agreeing to cooperate on issues of terrorism, on issues of pandemics, on issues of getting more gains by being with each other rather than putting themselves in a zone of war. International cooperation factored in by regional and international organizations brings in higher levels of regularity and predictability to international relations. Today, every international and regional organization has regular summits, regular meetings, zonal meetings, roundtable conferences, and there are certain soft power issues, that is, your exchange of people, your economic benefits, cultural linkages, cultural diplomacy. All these soft power issues have indeed paved way for institutional cooperation, and these regimes then constrain state behavior by formalizing the expectation. And all this acts in a manner wherein we see that states tend to cooperate with each other better. States tend to act in a manner that avoids war. Now, whenever we talk about the realist and the liberal school, or for that matter, the neo-neo debate, that is the debate between the neo-realist and the neo-liberals, then a significant distinction is on the understanding of power. Let's understand, how do you define power? Power is the capacity to control. It is the capacity to dominate. And when we look at power, for the realist and the neo-realist, it is absolute power. Power in the notion of zero-sum game. That is, my loss implies my enemy's gain. My enemy's loss implies my gain. This power is seen in a complete crude concept of absolute power by the realist and the neo-realist. The liberal school makes a revision of this understanding of power. That is, the liberals and the neo-liberals thereof, in the work of Keohane and Nye, tries to see power in a relative sense. Power can also imply mutual benefits. Power can also imply growing together. Power can also mean sustaining benefits together. So therefore, when we look at Woodrow Wilson's 14 peace points, or when we look at the work of Keohane and Nye, international then relations should not be seen as a zero-sum game. It is no more about ensuring that my enemy's loss should imply my gain. States feel secure enough to maximize their own gains regardless of what accrues to the other. Example in trade. Today, countries, even which have been the worst of enemies in the past, they have agreed to come together to ensure that they maximize their own one's gain without paying much attention to what accrues to the other. So therefore, for the realist, absolute power is much more important, but for the liberals, it is the relative power. For the realist, international relations is about a zero-sum game, whereas for the liberal school, international relations need not be seen as a zero-sum game. For the realist, international relations is about statism, leading to self-help, leading to survival, whereas liberals argue that states feel secure enough to maximize their own gains regardless of what accrues to others. Now, when we try to look into summing up our arguments, let's understand what have been the main advantages of liberal school of IR. And herein, I like to bring to you your notice the work of Robert Keohane. Robert Keohane argues that liberalism has indeed led to a shift, a new dimension in understanding of our international relations. It is an approach that factors in how cooperation is possible. It is a perspective that makes us understand that power is about cooperation also. Power need not be seen as domination. It is an approach that makes us see how international relations are much more plural than what the realists have made us understand. So, when we see that there is so much rise in human rights documents, human rights debates in recent decades, there is so much focus, there is so much hue and cry for the presence of morality in states in their conduct of international system. All these things they owe to the prevalence of the liberal school of thought. All these ideas, they are given much more emphasis by the prevalence of liberal ideas in international relations. So when we look at liberalism, it is indeed giving a refreshing view of international relations other than just a power conflictual domain. It is making us understand that there are new avenues from economics to culture to human resources to knowledge, wherein states can mutually, amicably cooperate and gain benefits with each other. There are new concerns in your international relations, be it be human rights, be it be morality, be it be our norms, our ethics, our international law. Remember what we discussed right at the beginning, various types of liberalism, republican, sociological, economic. All these forms of liberalism have somewhere given more concepts to us to understand in IR. Your democratic peace theory makes us see that how norms at home can have an impact of norms at the international domain. Your economics makes us understand how trade can act as an engine of growth and factoring benefits. So when we see that the liberal school in IR, from Woodrow Wilson to what was there in neoliberals, when you look at the work of Woodrow Wilson, the 14 peace point agreements, they are often seen as a parameter or main guiding thing to how to reshape world politics through ideals. Neoliberals try to be more scientific in their understanding of international relations by their notion of complex interdependence. But one of the disadvantages of the liberal school of IR that has been seen, it is seen as idealistic, utopian, because wars have happened, democracies have attacked each other. So when we look at this interconclusion of the liberal school of IR, of course it's a refreshing view which gives us new perspective to understand IR, but at the same time we have to see how it is idealistic and utopian. And for us as learners of international politics, every approach gives us a new parameter, and each approach gives us a holistic picture as to what constitutes IR. So IR has to be studied in totality, looking at the realist as well as the liberal school. So when we try to conclude it, we have to see that liberal ideas have always been present in international relations. They were earlier called as the idealist school of thought, which later came to be known as liberal school of ideas in IR. The liberal realist debate constitutes the first debate in the domain of IR. IR has been a discipline of great debates. The first debate was, how do we actually perceive the world? The liberal rejects the power political view of the realist school of thought. For them, international relations is much more cooperative. There are avenues of mutual benefits. Both schools of thought, liberal and the IR and the realist school, they have certain similarities and dissimilarities. When we look at similarities, both of them constitute state as the rational unit of analysis. For both of them, there is a notion of they both are status quoist theories. And lastly, both of them have a Western bias. When we look at dissimilarities in this debate, the realist gives primacy to power politics. The liberal says no, there are avenues of mutual benefits. The realist perceives the world as conflictual. The liberals perceive the world as cooperative. The realist gives primacy to state. The liberal says, of course the state is important, but this state has to be seen in presence of other actors like your international organizations, your NGOs and other forms of norms, regimes and institutions that have made way for IR as being much more cooperative. For the realists, the power is completely a zero-sum game. For the liberals, power need not imply domination, it can also imply cooperation. Liberalism has given great contribution in the realm of IR, be it be democratic peace theory, cosmopolitan democracy, international law, in study of international organization, amongst others. So therefore, to conclude, liberalism is indeed a refreshing perspective on how we understand and debate international relations. Right from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points to the work of Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace, or to Johann and Nye's idea on complex interdependence, liberal ideas have always been predominated and will always exist in our understanding of IR.